Good evening. Are we all together yet? I'm going to wait another 10 or 15 seconds to give everybody who is as incompetent with technology the opportunity to get online, press the right buttons, and get going with our hour-long conversation with Diane Hessan. I guess I'll be up there alone for a minute or two, but I think it's enough time now to let it to get going. We've had everybody must have pressed the right button by now, even though it's a long way from carbon paper and a Smith Corona portable typewriter. Here we are face to face in this age of technology. Well, let's get going. They're the two of us now. So welcome to everybody. I shouldn't be surprised that Diane turned out to be both a wonderful adult after her 4 years at Tufts, but that was over 40 years ago. She was a great conversationalist even then. She talked well, she was articulate, she was verbal. I didn't know then that she would turn out to be also one of the all-time great listeners for us, because that's what her book is really a tribute to. A tribute to her ability to listen to other people and to get other people to listen to her. She's been a successful CEO. She's been a successful businesswoman. She's done everything that she's touched has turned out to be fine. She's superb in all these other activities. But something about the condition of this nation got to her a few years ago and led her in a somewhat different direction. You know, it was over 160 years ago that Ralph Waldo Emerson, on the verge of the Civil War, as America was about to go into conflict with itself, gave up and said, "We are incompetent to solve the times we live in." So Emerson said, you know, it's hopeless. We don't communicate with one another. He looked around the nation that was about to be engulfed in a civil war and said that we can only do what we can do, and that is to embrace our polarity. And we are a polarized nation. And that's where Diane stepped in a few years ago, acknowledging the really nastiness of what was turning into political campaigns 4 or 5 years ago, and decided that she wanted to do something about it. And she reached out on her own to 500 voters around the country, in every state of the union, and a whole bunch of people. In the methodology in the back of her book, Our Common Ground, she tells you who these people are, where they come from, their race, their background, their religion, their states, who they voted for, who their party affiliation is. She has a very complete methodology. And she reached to these 500 people and said, all right, now I'm going to try to get you to listen to me and to listen to each other. And over a series of political campaigns, that's what she achieved. That's what she accomplished. And she got people who really don't want to listen to each other, don't want to talk to each other, to do what Emerson thought was futile. And she did it. She did it with the strength of her own personality and her own temperament. And it's still a bit of a miracle to me that how she got this result in this book. So I've read the book several times now. I've looked at these 500 people. She's still in touch with 100 of them right now. Many of you maybe remember the 16 or 18 pieces that appeared in the Boston Globe, and we'll talk about it. Here's what's going to happen now. We're going to chat with each other. I'm going to ask you a series of questions that we've gathered over for the next 30 minutes or 40 minutes. Then we're going to turn it over to you. You'll ask whatever questions you want of Diane, and we'll be out of here in an hour. When we're done, you don't have to be done with us. You already paid for your 4 years of college. You get the next 40 free. So you'll be able to have access to Diane, who's the more important person of our duo. If you want to ask me a question, I'd be happy to be available, but she's the one, and she'll be available to you when our hour is over. Okay? Diane, how are we doing?
Great.
All right.
Although I must say, Sol, it's being in front of all these people, having questions posed to me by you is both exciting and terrifying.
Well, you already got the A.
In 1973.
My greatest call to fame is that I invented grade inflation. I went from a Gittleman C to a casual B, but you had to show up and do the work. You were an A. That was different. I think Jonathan Tisch got a B, but I'm not sure. Okay, I've got some questions I'm going to ask Diane, and we'll wing it. We have no script really, but we'll see where we come out. So let's start at the beginning. At Tufts, you were not a political science major. You think it was English and economics. I think you were a double major. I went and checked your thing. How did you get interested in talking to voters?
Well, yeah, you're right, Sol. I wasn't a political person at Tufts. I spent most of the last 20 years, especially as an entrepreneur, mostly in CEO jobs. But the biggest company that I built starting in 2000 was a tech company called Communispace, now called C-Space, which is a next generation market research company. So we built that company to help major brands understand their consumers via the magic of the internet. So think focus group on steroids. Like, why put 10 people in a room for an hour when, with this new internet, you can have access to hundreds of your target consumers whenever and wherever you need their advice and feedback. So I fell in love with helping brands understand the people who bought from them. And in early 2016, the backstory is I actually got a call from a friend who I knew from the market research industry. And at the time, he was running strategy for Hillary Clinton. And he said, look, we have a lot of data about what's going on, but we have less understanding of why. And he wanted to see if I had any ideas. So, of course, I did. We talked for a few hours on the phone about how to really get to the core of what was going on for voters. And he asked me if I would help them with a special project to understand one group, which was undecided voters in swing states. And I couldn't resist. I mean, I left decades of kind of running companies and working with people, and I went to go sit alone at home in my office and talk to these undecided voters online every week using the same technology I used at Communispace. And it was fascinating and a bit of a breakthrough in the political world, which largely uses just polls and focus groups, but nothing that's kind of persistent and continuous. So it was a great use of what I had learned. And when the election was over, I thought I'd take another CEO job. But in the meantime, I decided to just put a capstone on that research. And I wrote an op-ed for the Boston Globe about what I'd been doing, what I learned, what I thought it meant. And it was published around Thanksgiving of 2016. And it was entitled Understanding the Undecided Voters. And in that piece, I basically explained that my undecided voters who switched to Trump did it based on one event more than any other. And that was when Hillary Clinton said that you could put half of Trump's supporters into a basket of deplorables. The incorrigibles, the deplorables. And what I explained was at that moment, my voters went crazy. I mean, they rejected the comment. They decided Hillary was too elitist for them. Some started calling themselves proud deplorables, et cetera. But the op-ed went viral, mostly because it was picked up and talked about by Jake Tapper on CNN. And suddenly I'm on every news show. And I thought, wow, I'm like making more of a difference after the election than before. So instead of taking another CEO job, I decided to set up my professional life so that I could spend about 25 hours a week in conversation with the electorate. And so I recruited, in December of 2016, I recruited an entirely new group. And this time it was of the 500 voters. This time, all points along the political spectrum, all states, all ages, all genders, all ethnicities. And I was off and running. I didn't really have a goal at the time, but I ended up talking to those people every week for about 4.5 years. Every Tuesday, there was a new project. I'd do a survey or a true false test or a fill in the blanks exercise, or I'd send them a video and say, watch this and tell me what you think, and so on. And when I learned something new and interesting, I'd write about it for the Globe. And I had about 50 columns over the 4.5 years on everything from, how millennials think about politics to why 35 million Americans think the 2020 election was fraudulent to, why a woman would ever vote for Donald Trump. And it was enlightening for me. And I love applying what I did for brands to the political arena. And, here it is. Then all of a sudden it all culminated in my book, Our Common Ground.
One would have expected to be like a 5-page pamphlet of common ground. I couldn't wait to get up in the morning to see if Diane had written an op-ed piece for the Boston Globe.
Thank you.
Is there really any common, did you discover any common ground among Americans?
Yeah, I mean, amazingly, there is. Look, when it comes to policy, there is generally much, much more common ground than you would think in the US. So first, let me be clear on what I mean by common ground, because it's not universal agreement. It's not a bunch of Americans sitting in a circle and singing Kumbaya. I mean, the common ground is that place, position, policy, recommendation that might not be perfect, but where we can all say, I can live with that. And so if you ask voters about the issues, immigration, gun control, healthcare, infrastructure, and so on, you can basically get 80% to be willing to compromise on a particular solution. And I've got 7 million pieces of data, so I'm pretty confident about this. So for instance, you can get 80% of our country to agree on an immigration bill that gives the dreamers a path to citizenship, builds a physical wall in some parts of the southern border, increases humanitarian treatment for, arriving migrants, adds more tech at our borders, and so on. It might not be an ideal bill to everyone, but people would be fine with it. But the bills don't pass. And one reason is that many of our elected leaders are better off with no resolution. They don't have to kind of talk about why they took a particular stand. And it's just, for instance, easier for a Republican legislator to scream and yell that immigrants are pouring into our country and, elect me and I'll stop them, or to be a Democrat and make the case for immigration and compassion and say, I'll make sure that no child is ever again put in a cage, and so on. So the act of resolving the issue takes away talking points for politicians. And so we perceive that we agree on nothing.
I mean, it's not surprising then that the last poll I saw said that 17% of the American people are satisfied with the performance of the Congress. I mean, they have no use for government at all. Americans have never been terribly in love with their government, but 17% is an all-time low. So will the screaming and yelling continue? I mean,
yeah. I mean, look, what I found in my research is that we have perceptions of the other side that are really inaccurate. So, for instance, if today you ask most Republicans about the Democratic Party, they will say, Democrats are a bunch of elitist socialists who want to take my hard-earned tax dollars and give them away to criminals, illegal immigrants, and people who are too lazy to work and who want to spend way more than we can afford and take away guns and allow women to use abortions as birth control, and who want to completely dismantle policing. Or if you ask most Democrats about Republicans, and especially those who voted for Trump, they will say that they are a bunch of hypocritical, uneducated deplorables who sleep with their guns, refuse to wear masks, deny that climate change is happening, and never met a Black person they liked. And both of these are wrong, but these stereotypes were on the ballot in our country last fall, and they dominate our perspectives. So just spend an evening watching your cable news channel of choice, and you will hear them painting a picture of the other side that is radical and also inaccurate. And then it all is amplified by social media and by the ones you just talked about, by our elected officials in Washington. So that the extreme views are getting the airtime and our headspace.
So why are you still so optimistic?
Well, I tried to write a book of hope. I mean, if there is all of this common ground, it seems to me that if we change the nature of the conversation that we have in our country, we have a fighting chance at a minimum to just bring the heat down and kind of get us out of the paralysis that we're currently in.
I look back on my own academic career of what I learned about American history. And I learned everything I knew about the Civil War from Gone with the Wind, and about the American West from Custer's Last Stand. I mean, growing up in America in the 1940s, early 50s, there was a view of American history that we all accepted. Now there's another view. Other historians have come up and have written much more complicated, nuanced studies, and people don't want to hear it. You know, I'm not sure who do you blame, the American historians, the profession, or what, but Americans don't seem to want to hear the narrative of the evidence that it suggests that American history has been something other than they were taught. I always said if I could press the button, I'd have everybody at least take 2 courses in American history from a disinterested historian, somebody who has no axe to grind at all, simply give the facts as the facts are. But people want to hear a narrative they feel comfortable with, and I'm a little bit in despair about that. Is there one story from that appeared either in the Globe or one of the questions you asked that really gave you a stronger feeling that something positive was going to come out of all of this?
Well, look, and I'm looking in the Q&A, and Mary is asking whether the polarization that you're talking about is just a myth made by the news media. I mean, the polarization is not a myth. We are divided. I just really believe that we are divided because of the perceptions that we've gotten from all of these activities that you just talked about, which we're just much more divided than we should be if you looked at how people really feel. And you can see that on the issues today. I mean, 90% of the country thinks that the $1 trillion immigration bill that was already passed, 90% of the country looks at their crumbling bridges, looks at what is happening with, lack of broadband access and everything. I mean, everybody is like, let's go, 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 go. And yet, we're parallels as a country. In terms of stories that stand out the most, there's so many stories, it's hard to pick one. I mean, I wrote a story about this viciously pro-life Alabama Republican who confessed to me last year that his 15-year-old daughter got an abortion. There's a story I write. It's
in Texas.
Yeah. There's a story I have, chapter 1, page 1 of the book about a Pennsylvania Republican named Gary, who was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. I knew he was going. He had a sign that said, honk if you think socialism sucks. He wasn't even near the Capitol, but by the time he got home, his family and his neighbors called him a terrorist and refused to speak with him. I have stories of Democrats who went to Trump rallies and young people who didn't think it mattered that they vote. And I guess if I had to pick one, in the last chapter, I have a story about 2 Americans, Joseph and Aviva, whose views were completely different on most issues and who came together over Zoom to see if they could have a civil conversation.
Well, I remember way back when, 20 or 30 years ago, I guess it must have been, we used to hand out year-old copies of Rand McNally atlases to all the incoming freshmen so they could identify where the Straits of Hormuz was, or where I'm wondering how many Americans if you gave them a map, could find Vietnam, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, anywhere on a map. I mean, what do Americans know or care about foreign policy? It's terrifying to me, knowing that we spend $780 billion a year on weapons, and that's not going to get cut. And that since the draft ended in 1973, we haven't had a military protest on the campus anywhere. I'm wondering, where is the country going militarily, and where do we know where anything is in the world? So what do you think? I mean, do these people, are they interested in foreign policy at all?
I know sometimes I think that all the people that are really interested in foreign policy are either current or former Tufts students, right? Or people who have degrees from Fletcher or the like. I mean, I will tell you, in my research, I would occasionally ask my panel about the issues they care most about. And I give them a laundry list to select from. And time and again, foreign policy was not even in the top 10 for Americans. People find it boring, but I think even more important to understand is Americans are very focused on their own lives in their own towns, and they're not up to speed on the basics. And this is Democrats and Republicans and independents. So take NATO, for instance. Most of my voters didn't know a lot about NATO, how it was formed, what it does. They certainly don't know. And the bar is not that high, Sol. We don't have to know about NATO what you know with your encyclopedic brain, but all they know is that the NATO members weren't paying their full complement of dues and that Trump got them to pay it. And what I want to make sure everybody gets is this is not a US-centric perspective, but this is more a real focus on our own tiny parts of the world. So another one of my favorite stories was a guy from Pennsylvania named Jim, one of my voters, and he told me a story about his nephew. So the nephew got into a college that was 3.5 hours west of their home. So 3.5 hours west, they have to drive. So to go to college, the family packed a bag and drove 2 hours west and stayed with Jim overnight to break up the trip. That going 3.5 hours was so far from them. And Jim said to me, Diane, do you think they know where Ukraine is? And that really struck with me. I mean, there's so much more here, but most Americans, for instance, were not riveted to the Trump impeachment hearings because of all the reasons the president might be impeached. People just could not get their heads around a problem that was so far away from them. And that's pretty much across the board.
Yeah, well, we're a country where most of the people still don't have passports.
Right.
And for many years, the largest major at Tufts was international relations. And you wonder, there's a disconnect between the country itself and education and the class, whatever it is. It's very difficult for me to get my hands around it sometimes. Did you find that education made a difference with your 500?
Well, look, education is a huge factor, but not for the reasons we think. So when most Americans hear educated people are more likely to vote for Democrats, they say, so Democrats are smarter. And I actually really think it's something else. So I'll give you another story. I had a voter named Beth who was a female Democrat from Arizona who was in her 30s at the time that she and I connected. And she had a fascinating background. So she grew up in Northwest Idaho in the middle of nowhere in a company that not only had no people of color, they had no brunettes. I mean, this is the truth. And she grew up with a huge fear of people who were different. So Beth ends up being a great student and she got a scholarship to Boise State University. And she went and she told me it was absolutely eye-opening. So she told me how exciting it was to get onto the campus and see every color and people from 35 countries and more. And it widened her aperture. It broadened her perspective on the world. That was the education she got going to college. And she started dating a guy who was Lebanese. She took him home for Christmas. Her parents were unhappy. They had that talk, it's either him or us. She left home and they eventually moved to Phoenix. But that story really stuck with me because college is about so much more than just the intellectual knowledge that you get. I mean, Boise State completely broadened Beth's perspective on our world, just as Tufts did for many of us.
It really is amazing. But I mean, the suspect of most people in the United States feel that American higher education is an enemy, not a friend. And the fact that we are the greatest universities in the world, it doesn't make any difference. They just don't trust us. They don't trust the faculty, and they don't trust what they learn. Education is an issue. What about gender? Did any of you had 500 people, you had a lot of women, you had you had every age group possible. You had an extraordinary cross-section, remarkable group of 500 people.
Yeah.
But how do they feel about women's issues? I mean, I grew up, I was 30 when Betty Friedan came along and Susan Sontag and Simone de Beauvoir and the whole women's movement began. What about now?
Well, look, women are so critical in elections. I mean, there's tons of data that says that women turn out at higher rates than men. So in 2020, the data says that women voted for Biden over Trump about 57 to 42. But think about it, that 42 is an enormous number, and it represents the women who just don't think Democrats represent them. So I first realized this phenomenon during the Clinton campaign when women who were undecided voters told me that they hated Hillary, that they thought she was an elitist Democrat who didn't care about women like them. And a lot of my women voters who supported Trump talked about the women's movement and said it's not a movement that would welcome them. That if they went to the March on Washington, they wouldn't have been welcome because they had different views. Or I remember one voter said to me, and actually this theme came up with a lot of voters, Diane, like not all women are pro-choice and not all women care. Like somebody said to me, Diane, not all women are like you. Like they don't care about breaking the glass ceiling. Like it's a nice thing, but it's not my issue. And it's not enough of an issue to get my vote. And sometimes I would push. I did get to know these 500 people so well. They're like family to me. And sometimes I push and just say, but don't you think it would be exciting to have a woman president? Wouldn't it be great for our daughters and our sons, for that matter? And many women said yes, but they wondered if Democratic women would vote for Ivanka Trump or Condoleezza Rice or Nikki Haley. So one of the things that I really learned through all of this is that not all women have, and care about the same issues.
Absolutely. I get it. Your last chapter talked about the inability to hear each other that's dividing us. Do you really think that the capacity to listen is the answer to what basically is America's problem?
Well, look, I feel that priority number one is that we have to turn down the heat. I mean, you said it about 15 minutes ago, Sol. The history, my husband, who is more of a historian, reminds me of this all the time. The history of the United States is not one where we're united all the time, but we have to just bring the divisiveness down, like to some reasonable level. And to do that, I am absolutely convinced we have to talk less and listen more. And it's not easy to do this when we're confronted with conflict, but listening is the most powerful relationship strategy we have. So instead of talking at each other, I've got these three favorite words, which is tell me more. So let's take an example of everybody's favorite issue, voter fraud. So according to my data, about half of those who voted for Trump in 2020 believe that there was fraud in the election. That's 35 million Americans. Now, if you believe that the election was legitimate and somebody says there was fraud, we're most likely to respond by talking, sending videos, sending articles, and generally conveying proof points. And everybody's favorite proof point is 50 out of 51. 50 out of 51 fraud cases were thrown out by the judges. I mean, come on. The problem is that response does very little to change the minds of those 35 million.
I know.
So instead, if you do say, tell me more, like, where does this come from? Tell me more about how you understand fraud happening. Two things happen. One, you learn a ton. And B, that person is much more likely to be open to what you have to say. So for instance, in the case of voter fraud, you might learn the following. Number one, that 51 court cases is a minuscule reaction compared to what happens when the Democrats felt something wrong happened. So the Democrats thought there was Russian interference in our elections. And what did we get? We got a commission and a Mueller report, and we spent $32 million to investigate it. But they think there's a problem with fraud, and we just get some local court cases. So not fair. Number two, people who believe there was fraud don't say, oh, I love Donald Trump. If he thought there was fraud, that's enough for me. They actually have done a ton of their own research. And you can Google this, say examples of voter fraud or whatever. It's just that they read completely different articles, and we know this, we all live in our own bubbles. Three, most people who, when you really kind of dig into voter fraud, most people have one very specific concern above all others, and that is mail-in voting and the potential for fraud there, especially when you can mail in a ballot without having to prove that you're the person whose name is on the envelope. The fourth thing is, and I know we have some students on this in this webinar tonight, like lots of young voters assume there was fraud because they can't understand how we're still filling in little black dots on a paper ballot rather than leveraging technology. And there's got to be something wrong with that. And then lastly, lots of voters have experienced the potential for fraud, such as, getting ballots for your children, even though the children left the city 10 years before. That doesn't mean, therefore, you believe them, but it is much easier to understand those people if you take a deep breath and try to investigate what's going on. So tell me more. And it does bring the heat down rather than elevating things and making them worse, which is what we're doing to each other.
Well, voter suppression is as American as cherry pie. We've spent 300 years deciding who shouldn't vote. And I believe the first ballot we ever had was something like 1897. Up until then, you just went into the place that you were supposed to give you and yell out who you're going to vote for and hope that somebody didn't hit you over the head with a club. So we've come a long way, but I'm not sure yet how the gerrymandering, the attention of the Congress to all these voter issues are going to bring a level of civility back into the dialogue. The other thing that bothers me particularly, having looked at maybe, 15, 20 presidential elections, I speak this as in a nonpartisan way, if it can be intended that way. I have not felt that we ever had two candidates quite as incompetent as the two that we wound up having to vote for. When are we going to start seeing people with some eminence or some whatever it is that the country wants in the way of candidates who are a little bit more of a choice than the ones that we've got? How bad is our political system corrupted? I mean, to wind up with what we wound up with to vote for, I found it a bit discouraging. Republican or Democrat. What would you advise the
I will tell you, I mean, in response to that, and then I'll talk a little bit about advice. I personally just can't figure out why anybody would want to run for office. It's such an extraordinary invasion of privacy. It's just, you have to have such thick skin. And then, imagine after all that and winning the election, going to Washington and feeling like you're getting nothing done. I mean, it's just got to be the worst job in the world. I will tell you that I kind of feel like I have pretty thick skin. And if I just think about the comments that were written to and about me when I used to write my op-eds, I mean, there are so many mean people out there. And in the beginning, and everybody at the Globe said to me, Diane, don't read the comments, don't read the comments. And of course, I read them anyway. And I started thinking to myself, wow, this is pretty benign relative to what it's like to be a public figure. And I just think it sounds scary and unsafe and frustrating. Having said that, if I were going to talk to somebody who was running from either party, what would I tell them? I mean, I guess I'd say 78% of American full-time workers say they live paycheck to paycheck. 71% are in debt, and over half of those in debt say they're in over their heads. They're saving less than $100 a month. I mean, our citizens are burned out, exhausted from COVID, petrified of getting sick and not being able to afford a doctor. And their sense of possibilities for them and their family has really been dampened. So, many of us, the highly educated, might think that we know the answers, but most Americans view people like us, and I'm thinking of Tufts grads, many Americans view us as elites and have for a long time, like way before Trump. I remember I memorized this, but in 2004, the Club for Growth fed into this narrative. They had an attack against Howard Dean, And what they called him was a tax hiking, government spending, latte drinking, sushi eating, Volvo driving, New York Times reading, body piercing, Hollywood loving, left wing freak show. And 17 years later, voters are still rejecting any signs of elitism in their candidates because what it signifies is that we don't understand the group that I just talked about. And that group they want a better deal. I mean, they view special programs that benefit special Americans as unfair. They are totally supportive of helping people in dire straits, for sure, as long as it's not forever. But this whole notion of personal accountability really resonates with them. You know, people want a deal. They want to say that in exchange for the benefits of living in an extraordinary country, in return, we will all work hard and participate in our communities and not expect to be taken care of unconditionally. And, you know, they want a government that gives them a voice. They want one that makes heroes out of the people who give more than they take, like veterans or first responders or teachers. And, you know, they do want leaders who will embrace innovation, but it's a different group. You know, when somebody who was a fellow researcher who I had look at my data every once in a while said to me, you know, Diane, you say to a lot of people, what was your childhood like? And we all say, well, I kind of had a normal childhood. But some of us who say normal childhood, you know, grew up in New York City and were in the subways at age 12. And some people who had a normal childhood, you know, got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and worked on a farm and, you know, whatever. There are many, many variations of normal. And I think it's one of my big learnings in this book is that when I think about Americans now, I think of a broader, much, much more diverse group of people than I had originally thought about.
Yeah, I have one bugaboo though, and I didn't see it come up in the picture of your 500 people. How many of them knew or had a relative who had been in the military?
Yes.
You know, I mean, we've coming through now 40 years of questionable wars, which we have not emerged victorious, spent trillions of dollars. Is this on their minds at all? That trillions of dollars are being spent? They're talking about giving their tax money to a bunch of freeloaders. We're spending trillions and trillions and trillions in wars that we're losing. So, I mean, maybe that's a product of my old age. I don't know. But I feel that the general voter is so badly informed about the nature of the country, and most of them don't have children who are vulnerable anymore because it's an all-volunteer army.
Yeah. The other thing, and I think you and I have just talked about this offline, but the other thing that I found really interesting is that if I actually did this, I asked a lot of my Democratic voters, how many people do you know who are in active military service right now? And many of those people, I mean, there was some group that knew a lot, but most Democrats would say somewhere between 0 to 2.
Yeah.
And for a lot of my Republican voters, especially people who were Trump supporters, they literally knew dozens. I mean, family members, neighbors, people in their community, and completely different perspective on things. Or when I talked about Joseph and Aviva, who were the two people that decided to, you know, experiment and see if they could have a conversation and get along with each other over Zoom. I remember when Joseph told me that he would do this, you know, red flag carrying property manager who lives in Southern Texas and loved Donald Trump. And he said to me, you know, I do want to talk to this woman who actually lived in Brookline, Massachusetts. He said, it could be really interesting. Like, think about it. I live right near the border and she's probably never been down here. And so I bet we have completely different views on immigration. So the context for all of this matters. And I think people think about the issues that are just, you know, front and center right in their own faces.
Diane, I was going to ask you about what advice you'd give to the two political parties, but I see we've got 18 questions sort of stacked up. And maybe we're going to go to our questions right away. And then anytime at the end, you can give advice about what you tell the Republicans, what you would tell the Democrats for a candidate. So should we get to our Q&A?
Sure. All right. I'm going to look through some of the questions here. So let me read a few. So Marsha Osborne, how does the fact that an anti-abortion man whose daughter had an abortion say anything, but that man is a hypocrite and wants to control women, he has nothing to do with? So Marsha, you would think that. I'll tell you what the story is. I kind of felt the way you did, but I said, okay, so I have to tell you that I am really, really shocked that this happened. And we actually had a phone call about it. And he said to me, well, look, we found out on Friday that she was pregnant. I was talking to him on a Monday. He said, we got together as a family. We talked about it. We prayed all weekend. And we decided to do this, and it was absolutely excruciating. He said, and I need to make sure you understand that it was excruciating because that's different from the way you pro-choice people think about things. And I said, what do you mean? And, we got into it, but the perception that he had is that people who are pro-choice, and I know not everybody likes all this language these days, but you know what I mean? The people who are pro-choice take abortion casually. It's like, oops, I'm pregnant. I guess I'll just go across the street and take care of it. What they don't realize is how for almost all women, that decision is excruciating. And that was a shock to him. He was just as shocked at that as I was, that his family would ever get together, and even think about it. Mark, how do you get politicians to put country over power or politics and try to resolve these problems until we vote out those interested in power and not progress were lost? Mark, I'm not really sure how we do that because I'm not a politics expert. I will say that sometimes I sit around and think there's never been a time in our country that's riper for a third party. I understand that the funds and infrastructure that you need to have a third party are, outrageous and make that very, very difficult to happen. But there is division in the Democratic Party, within the Democratic Party. I've written a lot about this, and there is division among Republicans about where their party ought to go. And people always say to me, did you have a lot of Democrats like Hillary voters in 2016 who ended up voting for Trump? Or did you have a lot of people who voted for Trump in 2016 who ended up voting for Biden? And I had some movement there, but for the most part, the biggest movement I saw was a move of Democratic voters to become independents and Republican voters to become independents. That was the biggest switch that I saw, to the point where I really see a lot of the country becoming more moderate, not necessarily because they're moderate in every viewpoint that they have, but just they've got this need to kind of look way to the right or way to the left and say, this is impossible, this is impractical, this is unaffordable, this is embarrassing, or whatever else. So there is a big movement of voters towards the center. And that is one thing that would get politicians to put country over power. Otherwise, I'm not really sure we can do much. I mean, there's so many people who are out there right now who are taking actions largely to hold on to their jobs and who are saying things largely because they know that it'll help them raise funds. So, when it comes to our legislators, it's pretty depressing.
Well, it always has been. We tend to think of a golden age sometime, but when you see how many legislators were beaten on the floor of the Congress with somebody else's sticks or canes over the century before this century, we've always had war going on.
Yeah, definitely. There are a bunch of questions here that are related to, like, really, Diane? I mean, do you really think that, doing some of what you're recommending is really going to work? And, here's my thought on that. Look, this is so important. I mean, as a what I mean, turning the heat down is so important. I mean, as a country, we have enormous problems. I mean, we have climate change staring us in the face. We have gun violence at unprecedented levels. We have huge problems at the southern border. Our bridges are crumbling. You know, the Russians are trying to hack our electrical grid. We have racism, structural racism issues. You know, the Chinese are beating us in critical industries, robots, cell phones, ships, cement. I mean, we have to address our most pressing problems. And yet we turn on the news and we hear about what Marjorie Taylor Greene said today, you know, or which famous person went out with a porn star last weekend. I mean, it's like watching the Kardashians, you know? I mean, the anger and the blaming has so distracted us. And so Washington is paralyzed, and we can't even pass a $1 trillion infrastructure bill that 90% of Americans want and think is urgent. So we have to do better, you know, and I believe that we can. What else do we have here? Regarding voting concerns, do you think the way to bring people together would be to spend the money and effort, thoroughly investigate and close up the potential for fraud that's present in our voting system? That way, whichever side of the fence people find themselves on, we could all be satisfied that elections are at least secured. You know, on voting concerns, the argument that's the most compelling to me from those who think there is fraud is how they feel like their opinions are really disrespected. I mean, I think it would be great to try having an expert bipartisan commission on the state of American voting that doesn't just look at claims of fraud, but just looks at processes, voter restriction, technology, I mean, just everything, and makes recommendations. And I think we are really late for that. I've been kind of screaming and yelling about that for a while now, just because I think that 2022 is going to be very, very tricky. But I think there are enough concerns on both sides of the aisle that I think it would be worthwhile. I think it's just worthwhile for us to take the potential for fraud in this country seriously. Another question: can we get, if we have a book and we want to have your signature in the book, can we get a book plate? So sure. I mean, if you have questions for me or Sol after this, if you have a copy of the book and you want a book plate with my signature to place inside, just make your request. They're going to do a follow-up email. It's specialevents@tufts.edu, and you can just let me know where to send the book plate and whether I should personalize it, and I will make sure that happens. But they will, the team here will put all that information in a follow-up email. Let's see. Your work seems to highlight the disconnect between voters and our legislators. Could it be because of the influence of money in our politics? Go on, Sol. You want to answer that one?
No,
go for it.
I mean, we've always been doing this. It's, again, I'm afraid I'm so old that I get the impression in my own mind that nothing is new. We've been doing this for centuries, and corruption is also part of our DNA.
Yeah. Bruce, who wrote this question, also has a little bit more here that I think is interesting. In 2010, Justice Kennedy, writing for a 5-4 majority in Citizens United, said, quote, "And the appearance of access or influence will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy." And what he says is, could that statement have been any more wrong, especially with the hindsight of 11 years? Do we give too much protection to speech, i.e. money, that does more to corrupt than inform? So, you know, personally, I'd say yes.
He was commenting on a case that had gone to the Supreme Court in the 1870s. That's how long corporations have been looking for this kind of judgment, and they got it then, and they've continued. It's nothing. It's just been going on. The validity that corporations wanted to have equal access to the political. This was just before DuPont Circle was created, and lobbyists started pouring into Washington in the 1870s for the building of the great railroads and the great expansion of American capital. So, you know, we've been doing it forever, and I don't know how we're going to stop it.
Yeah. Sal, here's another one for you. Vietnam taught thousands of folks how to make a bed and shine their shoes. Now, many recent young adults can't open a checkbook or locate Asia or Minnesota.
No, but they can go online and do something. Hey, once we ended the draft, Richard Nixon was very smart. He didn't want these kids on his back, so he simply ended the draft in 1973, and that was the end of protest. Now we got television commercials for wounded warriors every day saying that you got to take care of these people. They've lost their limbs, they've lost their arms, they've gone to Iraq, they've gone to Afghanistan, they get blown up, and the government's not taking care of them. So, how dysfunctional can we get? In the matter of the last 40 years of armed conflict, we have really blown a lot.
Yeah. So true. I'm looking at these. There are a bunch of questions about about media bias, and how do we get media to be more objective and tell the truth and everything. Here's another, this is not really common ground, but agreement. I used to, every once in a while with my voters, I'd say, okay, I'm going to give you 20 statements. Tell me true or false, or agree or disagree. And one of the things that almost everybody agreed on was the statement, like, that would say true is the media is biased. And everybody would say true. I mean, I remember once out of 500 voters, so say I got 450 responses, there was something like 445 people who said that the media is biased. I'm kind of cynical about this. I mean, I guess I feel that the days of turning on the TV or looking in social media and looking for truth are gone. I just think it's over. I live in the tech world, and so there are a lot of startups. I bet 3 times a week, I get a note from some technology executive that's trying to build a startup. They're going to build a media property that is going to be as objective as possible. I talked to one today called The Factual, Factual, and this guy is fascinating. He's got artificial intelligence, which is rolling up news and publishing the stuff that, according to their machine learning, is the most objective of all of the news they have. And they're publishing that in a newsletter. But I think in general, what we're going to have to do is we're all going to have to get educated. This is not just our kids. We're going to have to get educated in absorbing news and hearing news, and then knowing what questions we ask and where we go to investigate whether what we're hearing is true. What's that, Sol?
How do you get critical judgment? I mean, I can't read a newspaper. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they are left. I've reduced to now is reading the reporters of the Wall Street Journal, who seem to be objective and are capable of presenting the news detached and disinterested. The editorial page has gone berserk, but the reporters for the Wall Street Journal are very, very good journalists. But American newspapers, you read the Hartford Courant from 1798, and the things they said about Washington or Adams were awful. So the newspapers have never been. It's been Cary Grant, front page. It's always been yellow journalism.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
That's who we are. We have a very fortunate country in that we have 2 terrific oceans on either side of us and 2 long borders with one country, north and south. Our geography is our greatest treasure.
Yes, it is. It is. All right. Let me just do 1 or 2 more. Would it make a difference in people's understanding of elections if they knew what election officials actually did, from entering data on voters, how they clean the list, how they send out absentee ballots, how absentee ballots are counted, how poll workers are trained, which security measures are in place? Sue, who asked that question, yes. I mean, again, people make assumptions about what's going on. And I think the problem is that it's done differently everywhere. I mean, there's not a national system that says, here's how everybody is going to manage voting. Here are all the same machines, all the same processes, all the same forms. It's just different. So the perception is that, for instance, one of your issues, how they clean the lists, their perception is some people do a good job of it, some people don't do a good job of it. Let's see. Diane, what's your next frontier? Will you write another book? Any desire to run for politics? No politics for me. I mean, one of the things I love, for those of you who are out there, who are in business, I love the pace of it. I love the feeling of every single day, just feeling like you're kind of getting something done and moving things forward and making progress. And I actually remember having a conversation about 2 years ago with Joe Kennedy, who used to be one of our congressmen in Massachusetts. And I said to him, I just don't know how you do it. I mean, I don't know how you just fly back and forth every single week and feel like you're not getting anything done. And he basically said, you know, it's a temperament thing. It's in his DNA. He learned from his Uncle Ted that sometimes you just had a very, very, very big dream and it was worth slogging away, you know, on a weekly basis, you know, and going for that big dream, even if it was going to take 10 or 20 years. And I have great admiration for people who can do that, but it's certainly not me. So right now, I'm really involved in trying to get the word out about, you know, what we need to do and how we need to change the conversation. There are lots of really interesting organizations that are cropping up. They're also trying to do this and just saying, let's stop the insanity. Let's stop the madness. Let's stop feeling that we can't be with the people who we are closest to in our lives at the Thanksgiving table without, you know, really listening hard to each other, et cetera. And so I'm trying to do, you know, whatever I can to support those organizations.
Was JB Lyon in your class at all? Do you remember?
He was not. I know JB from entrepreneurship stuff at
Tufts. He's got an
Tufts.
organization that he's put together also to try to bring some sanity to Congress. It's terrific what you guys are doing.
Yeah,
you know,
thank you.
It really is very rewarding. Keep going. You got 24 questions still.
I know. Well, I think we've gotten a bunch of questions, but I know we're running out of time. Sol, I'm just going to flip it back to you to end.
Okay. We've got 4 minutes. We got 24 questions. So if you haven't get your question answered by Diane, get to her. She'll answer it. She'll take care of any problems that you've got. At the end of the day, we are a very complicated country. We'll do a lot. We're also slightly ungovernable. In many ways, the country is what the universities are: the incompetent, the incompetent leading the ungovernable. Nobody is trained to be a leader in universities. You become a PhD, you get to or an MD in Tony's case, and you become a president. Was he trained to be a president? Was Larry Bacow trained to be a president? No, you simply become. And that's what we do in our Congress too. Our politicians are just people. I just wish we had somebody great that we could vote for come the next presidential election, Diane. So quickly, you got a minute more to go. What advice would you give the Democrats and Republicans? I'll vote for anybody.
Oh my gosh. You know what that reminds me of? I remember I used to do when I was on cable news and, you know, they'd go, Diane, we have 15 seconds left. What's happening with the Democrats? You know, or whatever. I will tell you, we can have a whole other
chance to answer, but I'm telling you, we all want the same thing: somebody good to vote for in a couple of years.
Yeah, I think we all do want that too, and I'm very worried about next November on a million levels. But no matter which party you're in, you should be worried about next November.
If you were 87, you wouldn't be worried so much about that for next November. But it's true, you know. You're
87 with the mind of a 22-year-old.
My kids are in their 50s. My grandchildren are in their 20s. We just had our first great-grandchild. I want to see what kind of a world we're able to live, to leave them with. So, you know, it's still a very interesting country with a huge diversity of people. The good news is that 16% of all marriages are interracial. So, you know, someday we'll be consuming ourselves with this racial hatred, but more and more and more people are going to become mixed race, and we'll see how 50 or 60 years from now we wind up. There'll be an interesting experiment in people. We're still, you know, for all you think the Chinese are doing, they're falling apart a little bit. We are the country that everybody wants to come to. We are still the country of choice around the world. So let them come, and let's hope that we can figure this thing out and not become a bit of a nut farm. So now let's see. I think we just about ended our time.
Yeah. Sol, thank you so much for doing this, and to everybody who came on tonight. Thanks for all you're doing.
For Jonathan and everybody else, thank you very, very much. And if you have any other questions, remember we're still around, pumping away. So you can get to Diane, get to me if you have any other questions that you want to ask about, and that'll be fine. Okay. Do we hit the leave button now?
I guess so. Thanks, everybody, for all you do for staying engaged with the university.
Yes, by all means. Thank you very much for everything. Night. Take care.